From Dangerous Policy, I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
This is our week in review. So, Dangerous Policy is a channel aimed at intelligent people where we talk about important issues facing life and society. How was your week, Crispin?
It's pretty marvellous.
Yeah. Played a lot of poker, right?
Oh, I did, yes. It was a big poker week. Played every day. So that occupied a lot of my time. Also received a message from a semi-famous poker player. Not just famous for that. And she took me to task over something, which was, a criticism that unfortunately was fair, which I don't like because
you don't like being wrong.
Yeah, it seldom happens. As Winston Churchill once said, I often, I certainly love to learn.
Yeah. But
I don't always like being taught. And yes, she was right and I was wrong. But it was a very trivial, well, not trivial, but like a minor point. But that was good. We talked that out. What else happened this week? Our Meghan Markle thing. So we made a video a while ago. I'm sure I'll leave a link in the description about Meghan Markle and why everyone dislikes her, and explaining that it's not racism. It's about the relationship that the British royals have with the British public.
Yeah.
And how Meghan and Harry both broke that covenant and the backlash that accrues from that.
Yeah.
And so that went from...
has rewarded us with this Meghan Markle video.
Yeah, because she's doing that sort of tour now with Oprah and whatnot. People are finding a video against, and that's become our most popular video over the last couple of weeks. And Charlene was like, "Oh, look, we should do more on that. People want to hear about Meghan Markle." I'm like, "Look, this is Dangerous Policy, not Women's Day. Like, this is we will talk about serious issues here." So this is us keeping faith with our audience and our commitment to not just follow the algorithm, but actually talk about the issues that we think are important. Meghan Markle is not up there at the moment.
Not the moment, but I think it's just hilarious.
Maybe when she runs for president, like she said she was going to, it'll become a more worthy topic to discuss. But at the moment...
She is a very unique celebrity, though, in terms of, like, she always seems to be talked about in the media, like...
Well, of course, it's soap opera using real people, right? Like, it's reality television without reality television. People obsess over other people's personal lives.
Why do people do that? It's just because they're bored on their own, or they kind of just want to live in that dream? Because I guess
I have to say that's correct. I have to say that people are insufficiently entertained in their own lives. I mean, if you look at the demographics of people who buy romance novels, for example, they're all 30 to 50-year-old housewives, right? That just consume this material at a rate of knots. All the Mills and Boon novels, all the vampire fiction. People who...
So you tell me all the young adults.
Yeah, they just collect all these magazines covering celebrities and their lifestyles and things like that, following the Kardashians, all of that. It's the same demographic that consumes all of this material. And
I just wanted like perceived value of consuming this material, entertainment, I guess, right?
Well, it's I think there's something evolutionarily like attractive about gossip about drama. I mean, as someone once said, who's famous for a bunch of soap operas, they said, look, the only difference between television and real life is that television is life with the boring bits cut out. Okay, so people, or as Bill Gates put it, right? He said, look, in the real world, people have to leave the diner and go back to their jobs, right?
Yeah.
And he was making an inference on all of those soap operas and sitcoms that make jokes about relationships and things like that, where you've got all the friends, they all get together and at one place and they all have their jokes and whatever, and then they go on. So How I Met Your Mother is a really great example of that. Both the sitcom, but also elements of a soap opera, because there'd be continuing storylines. There's a really good blend, really clever blend of those two elements where each episode would have a theme and the theme would end and it would be like a sitcom and nothing dramatic would change episode to episode, but there would be overarching story and then one overarching meta plot is How I Met Your Mother, right?
Yeah.
And they would all meet in that one dining area.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it was really interesting in that respect. But that's what people are excited about. Now, I think How I Met Your Mother had a much broader audience because it was also really funny, right? And so people could watch it who weren't following the personal relationship dramas with like who Ted was dating or whatever. It was all about the jokes, but then some people could watch it from the overarching story of like how these relationships were unfolding, attaching themselves to different characters and seeing it played out in that way. And by the way, Barney was the only character worth watching, of course.
Okay. That's so funny. All right. Let's just stop there.
Hey, no argument from me. I mean, but yeah, it's I think unfortunately it'll be a characteristic of our society. It'll play out in different formats in different ways for forever. People will always be interested in gossip. People will always be interested in drama. People will also always be trying to spice up their own lives by attaching themselves to various escapisms and fantasies.
I mean, it's just, some people it's a guilty pleasure. Like the other... no, we never published it. But yeah, I watched Married at First Sight for the first time, which is a show on TV. They look at who's approving me. It is essentially a bunch of 30-year-olds like wanting to find a man, and can't find a man, so they go on a reality TV show, get paired up with a guy they've never seen in their life, and they are married. So social experiment, and I admittedly was pretty like engaged for that hour and a half. Hey, my mum was like, "Well, Married at First Sight is on." I'm like, "Okay."
You know what? I actually wouldn't mind watching a show like that took it seriously. Like if it was because the Married at First Sight show, of course, is you get the trashiest of trashy stuff that you can possibly get and slap it all together and see if you can make a show.
Bogans or bleached hair.
Yeah,
those are two criteria to get on the show.
Yeah. So they're obviously looking for a particular type that will appeal to a particular audience, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, if it was serious, if it was like, okay, I have a theory that we can get two people who have never met each other to get married and have it work, right? And actually follow the same couple over like a year, like make sure that the show doesn't air for like 2 years after the marriage or something.
Yeah.
And you do that with a bunch of different couples and you use like science and a lot of careful analysis and use big data. So, okay, what makes a marriage work? How do we know? What are the kinds of things that set people up for success? And put those things in place, right? So you go, okay, well, if they get counseling within the first year, then this happens and blah, blah, blah. So that we put those pieces of the puzzle and really do some serious matchmaking and see if science can trump the spark, if you like. And I think that would be a really interesting experiment to run and we can get some serious volunteers for that. You wouldn't have to go find, people who are just going to create drama on TV. You could actually find serious people who are like, you know what, I'll try that. And we could turn that into a proper show. Maybe if you like it, maybe we can crowdfund for it. It'd be good.
Yeah, they do have matchmakers, but I don't know how reliable they are. Looking at the data, they do weird things, but it could just be like, look at the stars, and it's stupid. I don't know.
Well, every decision, and I'll do a video on this at some point, but everything that happens in your life
is based on Jupiter. No, I can't.
Everything that happens in your life is based on probabilities.
Right.
Okay. So when you get up and you walk outside, there is a certain probability of rain, right? That's the most obvious one because meteorology uses that metric quite well when they say, 86% chance of rain tomorrow, 20% chance of rain, whatever. What that means is looking at past history of similar weather conditions, the probability of rain occurring in that period of time is X. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but you can do that for everything. The probability that the bus arrives on time. Well, a certain percentage of the time it doesn't, and that will be at different points of the day on different routes. It'll have a different degree of probability. The probability of you getting certain health conditions, the probability of you having like a car accident the next month or whatever. All of this stuff has probabilistic numbers attached to it.
I mean, the probability of you being born, like.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it goes from 0 to 100, right? Because it's like you couldn't possibly predict that your parents would meet. Like, because you go for as far enough back, the probability becomes zero, right? Like,
Yeah.
think 500 years in the future, like the probability that my descendant will be born exactly 500 years in the future, let's say 10 generations hence, and their name will be Samuel, and they'll be born in Kazakhstan. Well, the probability of that is zero, right? Or close enough to that is such an absurd proposition because so many things have to happen in a row that you could never replicate that. Whereas once, but you know, there is a probability that there will be someone 10 generations hence if I have kids and everything, and that there will be someone born, and once that person is born in that time and place, well, that probability is 100 because it's already happened. So it's one of those things that's impossible to predict, but also inevitable. Whereas probabilistically, that you'll find someone who you marry and is happy with forever, we can assign probabilities to that, and we can actually assign probabilities to the different types of people. So let's say, for example, 50% of marriages end in divorce, as it is in a number of Western countries, right? And just use a round number, 50%. That means that 50% of marriages fail completely. 50% of marriages fail, whereas a number of those that don't fail would have failed, except one of the two of them passed away, right?
Yeah.
So that's an additional percentage. Then there's a percentage of people that have stayed together because they only for financial reasons, like they don't want the cost of divorce.
Yeah. Or they have kids.
Well, but that's another factor. But like just a factor of like they're not together in any way. They're just physically separate and they live different lives. They just don't want to go through the financial rigmarole of getting a divorce. Like it costs a lot of money to separate all these assets and everything. So they just don't bother, right? And they go, okay, we have an agreement between us and let's just live our different lives. And then there are people where one person is happy in the marriage, the other person isn't. And that other person doesn't want to leave for whatever other reason. And then, perhaps loveless marriages that exist because of children and they reserve the marriage because of that fact. There might be relationships that are just codependent and they're like, look, you know, we rely on one another for these things, but, you know, it's a loveless marriage, but we, you know.
It's very utilitarian. They see each other, like, I don't know, on certain dates of the year, and then they live.
Yeah, exactly. And then so of a minority of a minority of a minority of a minority are going to be genuinely happy, loving marriages throughout their lives, right? So if we just take that cohort, okay, and we look at what are the specific characteristics across the entire spectrum of different things to look at, that predict that. So some of it will be wealth, class, education. Some of it will be physical appearance. Some of it will be, obviously, a lot of it will be values and attitudes to money and cohabitation and whether or not they had children and all this sort of stuff. So that a lot, you just be able to drill that down to a very fine degree. But even though it's a minority of a minority, you'd be able to look at that over a large enough sample size, and then be able to make predictive elements and say, look, these are the factors of a successful marriage that we've seen as commonality across characteristic of those that are happy and successful and loving and want to be together forever. And what we should do is we go out and find people with these characteristics and put them together and see what happens, right? And that would be an interesting television show, to have a Married at First Sight thing where you've got a lot of people who are running the show, not being matchmaker, romance experts, but just being data analysts and mathematicians, because they're probably the ones that are, like in every other domain of human endeavor at the moment, they're probably the ones that are going to have the most success.
Wow, deep. That's deeper than I expected, but man, that's why reality TV shows are fun, and that's why Christmas is alright for it. But that makes sense. I mean, you could put that onto everything, but I think we shouldn't look into it too deeply.
But we should, though. That's the thing. We absolutely should, because it
would create genuine value.
Isn't it the most important decision you'll ever make? Isn't that the single most important, like who to spend your life with? Isn't that is there any decision that's more consequential? And why not use evidence?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think dating apps instead of like either trying to recreate like Black Mirror, which was had that exact thing, losing data to find your 99% match.
Yeah, but it's gone in a really bad way. Like that was the promise of it. But what actually happened in actual fact was that people reduced, instead of exploring the characteristics of what caused success, people reduced relationships to what they imagined that they would want on paper, right? Which is a really one-dimensional way. So what gives romance its spark, what gives courtship its mystique, if you like, is the surprise element, right? So it's one thing to get people to look at huge data sets and go, okay, here are the characteristics of a successful marriage. Let's see if we can replicate this artificially, right? Which is a clever thing to do. Whereas in your own individual life, the thing that gives it your relationship its own soul, if you like, is the surprise element. You look at a piece of paper and you go, okay, this person ticks this box, this box, this box, and this box. But when you're flicking left and right on your phone apps, but it's really not predictive in any way of how you'll genuinely feel about someone, right? And what it invariably does is it sharpens an already sharp distribution curve. So, for example, if you are someone who ticks all of the boxes, because everyone has the same boxes, right? Every woman wants a guy who's tall, wealthy, educated, blah 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 blah, right? So a guy who has those characteristics in his bio, well, he's going to get a lot of attention, right? And so he'll have his pick of the audience, okay? But each individual woman imagines that's what they want in a guy. But when they meet the guy, it's a much more complicated decision, right? So what we see is an inefficient distribution of partnerships. What was expected was that people would be able to go for people much more efficiently because they wouldn't be dating all these deadbeats that they didn't have any interest in, and would have much greater chance of meeting someone that was more compatible for them because they would be using dating apps to reach people of mutual interests and characteristics. Whereas in actual fact is
people self-selecting.
Well, yes, and people having, like, in actual fact on these apps, for example, 3% of the guys get like 50% of the attention, right? And I'm sure the reverse is true as well, because what's on paper, what's on your profile is just the same thing that everybody wants, right? So they think they want it anyway, so they'll give it. But when they actually, meet them or they miss out on the people that they would have actually been more compatible with, because they don't necessarily know consciously what it is that's best for them. Whereas if you were to use big data of what already works out there and use that to determine what is how to meet up would be much better. So I think that the person who creates the online dating service, which says, okay, you're going to be given someone that you have to go on a date with, right? Like by signing up to this service, you'll be allocated a date, okay?
Based on, I don't know.
Based on what we've decided, okay?
Right.
And it'll be like a blind date or whatever. We'll give you some questions to ask each other. And I think using proper science, like not just do it as a cash grab, using actual proper science to make this work would be a much more successful way of doing it, and much better for all the parties involved, because they would meet someone who the algorithms, the computer data scientists would say, look, this is actually probably has a good probability of working based on all the successes we've seen in the past. So let's see if this actually plays out. Now, nothing's guaranteed. That's why it's a probability. But
high probability.
Yeah, much more effective than self-selecting, right? Because you don't choose who you meet, right? When you're out there in your day-to-day life, you run into someone and the sparks fly and your chemistry and all of that sort of stuff. It's not like you go, okay, I'm going to meet this person who's here. You don't know that ahead of time, right? You only run into them by chance. And then you fall in love and get married. Well, if you did that in the same sort of mechanical, artificial way with experts in the background doing all the numbers, then you've probably got a much better hope of finding a successful partner. There you go, business venture.
Wow, we're just going all these ideas. Better patent it.
Well, yeah, and people I actually think people want to lose some control.
Yeah, I think so as well. When you're like overwhelmed all these like options out there, then you're always looking at the grass is greener, and at the same time, then you don't actually make a choice because of that. So
yeah, so maybe I mean we've talked about it here for the first time in the weekend review, but let's say next week I'll do a video on the way dating should work in the internet age.
Oh, okay.
Because I think that would be an interesting discussion. Because people don't want people lose the romance if they have total control. Like part of a relationship is not having control. Like that's one of the things that you have to give up when you're in a relationship is control, which is one of the reasons I'm blissfully single. But
I have nothing to reply to that, so yeah.
Charlene's thinking about many other reasons why Crispin might be single.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was a benefit for me when I met my partner because we had chatted literally for 5 minutes. And then I didn't want to do a uni assignment. So I was like, let's go for coffee. And it's like, sure. So we're like, it was just such an in the moment thing. Had no expectation. It was like, it almost felt like I bumped into them, right? Like there wasn't any,
Absolutely. There wasn't any build up of cheesy pickup lines.
Yeah, like preempt all this stuff and going through like the checklist that had.
And what you said also, guys, I mean, this isn't a pickup channel or anything, but one of the best places, I should say, to meet potential partners is the library. Okay, because as Charlene said, she wanted to get out of an asylum. And when people are at the university libraries or they're at the public libraries, they're not there, generally speaking, because they just love being at the library. They're generally there because they're studying for something. They've got some assignment that's hanging over them, and goodness me, do they want a distraction. So if it's a really good place to get someone's attention. If you're
and the greatest thing is, right, people at the library are obviously self-motivated, probably intelligent because they care about their study and whatnot. So the pool is actually
so despite these drawbacks, it's a really great place to meet.
Well, yeah, my friend is going to do that. One thing we didn't address is that we didn't do a weekend review last week because
that's not true. We did.
Yes, we did.
We did a weekend review, but the technology failed. So
yeah,
because actually it didn't even fail. We do have a recording of the weekend review. It was actually a pretty good weekend review.
It was, but our OCD with it wasn't in focus, and I know Elias will be like, it's not in focus. It was definitely not in focus.
Yeah, way out of focus. So the quality assurance kicked in, and we're like, no, we can't put this up. So does mean that we can talk about some of those videos now.
Exactly. And Poland, hello, or Eastern Europe, hello, they have introduced a law, or they're trying to introduce a law with big tech.
Yeah, it's the most obvious law. So Poland is introducing legislation that says you can't deplatform someone, you can't censor them or shadow ban them unless they say something that contravenes Polish law, i.e., social media is where the speech plays out. They claim the protections of a telephone company, i.e., the telephone company doesn't control what you say over the phone, and thus they must behave like a public square. Yeah. And in that space, it's not private companies that determine what's said or not said, but individuals in accordance with the law of their nation state. And Poland says, the Polish government are like, we're the ones that determine this, not private big tech. And thus, if you wish to operate and service Polish citizens, then you have to uphold their freedom of speech rights. And that's an extraordinarily important development that I think is just so self-evidently needed around the world. And I'm hopeful that the success of that legislation will be a model and a roadmap for the rest of the world, and Poland really leading the way.
It's very sensible because I guess big tech, I don't know, I'm thinking, right, big tech, I think back to that video you did, Twitter CEO saying, it's a very complicated issue when they banned Trump and he had this whole spiel about it. Like, it's almost like big tech are also lost on their responsibility, how far they can actually go.
Well, I'll read you something evil that's happening with Google right now, right? Along this line. It's shocked me. This is just in the last day or so.
Oh, okay.
Here we go. Okay, so this is Google making an announcement. I'll read it out to you. As question and answer, is whether or how a given algorithmic behavior should be addressed. And Google says, if a representation is factually accurate, can it still be algorithmically unfair? Their answer, yes. For example, imagine that a Google image inquiry for CEOs shows predominantly men. Even if it were factually accurate representation of the world, it would be algorithmic unfairness because it would reinforce a stereotype about the role of women in leadership positions. However, factual accuracy may affect product policy's position on whether or how it should be addressed. In some cases, it may be appropriate to take no action if the system accurately reflects current reality, while in other cases, this is the crux, while in other cases it may be desirable to consider how we might help society reach a more fair and equitable state, either via product intervention or broader corporate social responsibility efforts. So what Google is saying is, they're not just an impartial search engine reflecting people's search inquiries. They're going to manipulate the algorithm, and they already are, frankly, showing people results based on their utopian worldview, irrespective of what actual reality is. So they've just given one example here, which is like if you type CEOs into Google, you won't get the most algorithmically appropriate images. You'll get whatever they've manipulated to make sure you see a lot of women, okay? But you could apply that to many other things as well. Certainly, they famously had manipulated their image search so that if you type white heterosexual couples into Google and you do an image search, you'll only see gay men, right? They've done that already. And that was because they assumed that only white nationalists would be interested in searching for that term, and therefore they thought they would troll them by manipulating the search results. But the dark, perverse aspect of this is that when you do a search into Google, you can no longer trust the results as being factually accurate or representative of what the algorithm is telling you. It could be someone behind the screen saying, okay, well, this is the information we want to show you. And that is beyond evil. That is like totalitarian dystopia.
I mean, wasn't that the whole thing that the whole American people were criticizing when Trump was elected, thinking it was like a Russian conspiracy, and then all the algorithms, the fake news? Like, isn't that the very thing people are against? And
yes,
and yet they're using the very thing to promote their own ideologies. And what?
Yes, so it's essential. It's essential that governments take control of this. And Poland is doing one step when it comes to social media in terms of broadcasting and individuals communicating and sharing ideas for social media. So that's a critical thing. Google is obviously the next step. They should introduce laws to say you will not interfere with the algorithm in our country unless doing so is at the behest of our government and law, right?
Yeah.
Like if it's not, if you wish to operate as a search engine platform, then you have to abide by our laws. And now you might be able to compromise on some of it and say, look, okay, you must, in any instance where someone searches for a term and it's not showing exactly what the algorithm says, there must be a big giant warning label at the top and big red borders and say, look, we've adjusted the search results, but also provide the option to click here to see the actual results, right? So if Google thinks that they're so good that people need to be protected from their own search results, then it should be up to the individual user to overrule Google's helpful parental intervention, if you like, and see the results for themselves. Because this is truly dystopian stuff. I can't actually criticize it enough, and how grateful I am to the Polish government for doing something about it. Hopefully we will see this replicated elsewhere. Certainly the appropriate way to regulate big tech, what Australia had done with trying to force Facebook and Google to pay media companies for advertising, was just, silly.
Yeah, I don't like they didn't eventuate anything, right? So we got our news back on Facebook, but they also like apparently like heavy negotiations with the code.
Well, I mean, the only people who lose out are consumers and smaller media companies, right? Because what Google has done is they've made separate deals with certain media outlets to comply with the code and not others. So when you search for news in Australia in Google search, only certain news distributors come up. So they've been privileged in the marketplace. So they've done exactly the opposite of what was intended, right? Because now they're getting privileged position in an anti-competitive space. No one else can enter into the market. And consumers obviously don't see the broad breadth of news to be able to get their information from a variety of sources. So, I mean, yeah, the ACCC really blew this one up. But anyway, that's a
whole other story, but that's interesting. What does it take for like a country to like replicate? So I know like for that, I mean that Google, right? With this law with Poland. So if it was like quote unquote successful and you know people stepped away, Facebook stepped away, how does other countries like look at that? So policymakers like, like I don't know. Is there a...
So I think, first of all, it needs to be shown to work. And I think proponents of it will need to be championing it in other forums. So Poland will need to take it to the EU. Poland will need to take it to other kind of, you know, G20 meetings and things like that to encourage other governments to take this on board. You might even find a few champions within big tech as well, because some people in big tech realize that this is an inappropriate role for them, and they've been encouraging governments for a long time to kind of say, look, you know, we're trying to comply with it. You're telling us all this kind of conflicting stuff, right? So on the one hand, you're saying, look, free speech, but on the other hand, you're saying, why don't you protect, like, deplatform all the Nazis, and why are you allowing people to do illegal things on Facebook Live and all this sort of stuff? So a lot of them, it's a headache, and they would just be perfectly happy to have governments tell them what the rules are. But I think for a majority of big tech, unfortunately, they're just drunk on the power and wouldn't want to give it up unless they're forced to. So thankfully, the Polish government is going that direction. Hopefully just the sheer example of its success will inspire others. But the problem is I don't think it's being formally, because the Polish government legislative process, it takes a while, so I don't think it will be in effect until like the end of the year.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's more like watch this space, see what happens. And another country, Lithuania, my favorite. Like, it's becoming my favorite country, but I've never been there yet. Is standing up to China. Like, what is this? Like, what, all these European countries. And yeah, it's quite amazing. When you showed me the news, I was like, wow, like they're game.
Yeah. So for those that missed the segment, Lithuania is opening up a trade mission to Taiwan.
Yes.
Which is for China, Chinese Communist Party, an absolute red line. So I expect China to seek to retaliate against Lithuania pretty fiercely, but an extraordinary step for Lithuania to take. And one thing about Lithuania in particular, and I think the other Baltic states more generally, because Estonia is also going in this direction too, and probably Latvia, is that because they've had the direct experience of Soviet occupation, they understand what, you know, controlling people's speech, controlling people's thought processes, using identity as a means by which to segregate people, in the case of communism of class, but obviously in wokeism it's race, then where that all leads, and the true nature of a totalitarian dictatorship, unaccountable to the people, and liberal democracy. Like, there's a famous saying that says, war is delightful for those that haven't experienced it. I think the similar thing could be said for democracy, and say, you know, democracy is a disaster except for people that have lived under anything else. And the Lithuanians, the Poles, the Baltic states, they've had an experience, a national experience that Western Europe hasn't had, and so Western Europeans take it for granted. Which they don't, and they understand that being a government, being a country is more than being an economy, right? To be a government, you're trying to look after a society. And the Lithuanian people are saying Western liberal democracy is something we've adopted for a reason. And the rise of China threatens that worldview, right? It's not just that China is a dangerous country in itself, but its rise fundamentally threatens to reshape the global order, undermine the hegemony of Western liberal democracy. And Lithuania, with its tiny economy of 3 million people, are willing to stand up and say, no, we're not going to take that. And we're not going to be bribed through trade promises and things like that into accepting that China will be the center of the world. And that's just an extraordinarily brave, it's a brave thing for any country to take, but for Lithuania, I think it's extremely bold. Yeah. And it follows a tradition where they've done that repeatedly. Like I said in the video, they're the ones protecting the government in exile from Belarus, escaping Lukashenko. They're the people that are most vocal in the European parliaments and forums, criticizing what's happened with Alexei Navalny, the opposition figure in Russia who was poisoned with Novichok. And so, Lithuania is the leading light for this, and they deserve a degree of respect, but also concern.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was going to say, so what could happen? But obviously, China will retaliate.
Yes.
Because, China retaliated to us with the barley and the wine. And
yes, and I would caution the Lithuanian government into thinking that what the Lithuanians would be saying to themselves is that, we're not that reliant on China, and therefore we don't have to worry about China. And unfortunately, that's just a bit naive. China has enormous influence around the world. So just because Lithuania may not have strong bilateral trade with China at the moment, China will lean on Russia to say, look, stop buying Lithuanian cheese. China will lean on Germany and France and say, look, we'll stop buying your cars unless you do something about these pesky Lithuanians. So Lithuania may not have a lot of direct trade with China, but there are a lot of countries that do have heavy dependence on China and a lot of aspirations for China in the future have a lot of leverage over Lithuania. Yeah. So what's really important now is for the other countries that stand to be influenced by China to harm Lithuania, to resist that pressure. So Germany, France, they need to step up and they have to back the Lithuanians. And when China comes knocking and say, look, you've got to do something about these Lithuanians or else, they have to say, buzz off, right? So I'll be watching very closely the way the other EU countries react to what Lithuania has done, see who is supportive and who's sort of quiet, and see, whether or not these countries are, willing to publicly back and support what Lithuania has done, or whether they are willing to kowtow before the Chinese Communist Party and threaten Lithuanian exports and trade as a means to do what the Communist Party wants. Because as soon as you start doing that, as soon as Germany goes, I'm worried about our car manufacturers and for the sake of these bloody Lithuanians, as soon as the German government, for example, does that, well, then they're basically ceding their own sovereignty to China. It shouldn't be up to Beijing to determine Germany's economic and foreign policy, right?
Yeah.
And so it's very important that the other EU countries show some solidarity here and don't just take the tasty Chinese money.
Well, I hope that through this pandemic and COVID, there's more countries are questioning whether they should be reliant so much on China, right? Would they? Do you think because of got the aircon that's fine? Yeah. It's too hot in Australia.
Yes. So apologies for that noise. That will definitely be picked up on these mics, but that's okay.
That's fine. So yeah, because of all that, perhaps we might see some resilience to Chinese money, and I
hope so. But see, Australia made the same mistake, right? Australia I mean, to be fair, there was a lot of people in the mainstream at that time imagining that as China got rich, it would democratize, and we've been through that many times. So I won't go into the story here. And that was always kind of a self-serving belief, but that was a widespread belief. And so Australia was quite willing to overlook all kinds of stuff in order to get rich off the back of China. Now that Australia is displeasing the Chinese Communist Party, we're seeing the true extent of our dependence and the cost to Australia for standing up to China. Europe isn't there yet. Europe isn't as dependent on China as Australia. Europe, of course, massive trade between the EU and China, biggest trading partners, but the Europeans aren't overwhelmingly economically tied to China the way Australia is and much of Asia is. And so there is a window there for it to be a choice, because they also have to learn the lessons of Australia. The Europeans must know that no matter how much trade they do with China, China's not going to democratize, right? It's just going to make China more powerful, and China will eventually be able to fully challenge the United States in every possible domain, including the military domain, and vie for hegemony in the world affairs, right? So the Europeans have to make a decision as to whether or not they want to tie themselves to that future, knowing that what this is not, them helping the Chinese people kind of lift out of poverty and then democratize. What they're doing is helping China take over the world. And if they want to do that willingly for the sake of a few dollars, they can do that, but they have to do it with their eyes open, knowing that that's what they're doing. They shouldn't be confused about that, right? It has to be very clear that they are willing to embrace a Chinese-led world order in which a totalitarian regime is the most powerful country in the world. If not, they have to do something to stop that from happening, in which case the Lithuanians clearly have planted a flag there, which is great. And now is a moment of inflection for these European powers.
Yeah, I'm sure, surely, these foreign, spectators, all these foreign intelligence agencies consider these things, right? Or do they think that...
They do, but they're just one interest group. So as I said, the Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service really did come up with an amazing report about CCP influence in Estonia. But they weigh that up against the enormity of the Chinese cash, right? Like, if you've got all these constituents that are looking for jobs and investment and trade opportunities and new markets, and China is growing rapidly, and there's enormous pressure on you as a government to get a piece of that pie and rain money on your constituents to get re-elected. Well, there's a lot of advantages there to do that. I mean, and having a good relationship with China, has advantages. Like, if it did, no one would do it, right? Yeah. But the question for Western countries is it worth it? Is it worth it? And the degree to which your sovereignty is abrogated and your dependency increases, and that lack of sovereignty increases over time as you become more and more dependent on China. Is it worth it for that? And former Soviet occupied countries are better at judging that, I think, than those that have never experienced a life in which totalitarian regimes have such control, right? Because you go, well, is it really going to be that bad if, we can get rich now? Let's say you're in France, right? And you're faced with the choice of okay, well, China is willing to rain money on us. We can go outside and just bathe in the digital money, okay? And all we have to do is not criticize China or talk about their human rights abuses, and they will just continue to give us money. And you go, well, that's not really, given the advantage to the French people, the promise of our future economic development, the future trade relationships with the world's most populous country, is it that big a deal, right? And so they go, current benefit for my immediate political future, right? Versus you're talking about something that could happen in the future. We don't really know. We don't know what a super wealthy country China will look like. You're a bit of a downer, okay? It's easy for the French or the Germans or the Spanish or the Italians or whoever, or the British, to choose the easier option. and go, well, I'll just take this free money that's sitting here.
Mm.
Whereas if you need to get the perspective of history to really appreciate the interest payments you're paying on this. And I think the Lithuanians have got that sort of far-sighted view because they can look into the past and say, okay, well, what would we be willing to give up or forego to avoid the past from repeating itself? What would we forego so that Western liberal democracy is the predominant cultural norm throughout the world in perpetuity?
Mm.
And the Lithuanians are willing to value that appropriately. If you properly value your individual sovereignty, your freedom of movement, your freedom of expression, your ability to criticize, if you value that appropriately, then no amount of money from China is going to dissuade you from that position. And unfortunately, Western countries haven't experienced that properly, whereas Eastern European countries tragically have.
Yeah, it's quite noble of them to do that. Yeah, so we'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah. So, all right. There's another topic I kind of want to talk, and it's kind of controversial. Vaccinations.
Oh yeah.
The vaccine. So it's doing rollout. Finally, Australians are getting the jab, and hopefully, I mean, well, us, I guess we're like not of a high risk group, so I guess we are later. But it is interesting. I feel like people are divided whether this vaccine should be mandatory, and you listed out some reasons why it should not be mandatory.
Yeah.
But I just feel like because there's a whole cultural movement against anti-vaxxers, like in terms of like how they're perceived in the media, that they're just lunatics, that we won't make it mandatory, but we'll coerce them into doing it anyway. It is interesting.
Yeah, and here's the thing: anti-vaxxers might be lunatics, right? Like I'm all for rationality and evidence-based decision making, right? And so, a lot of the criticisms, a lot of the fears and anxieties of the anti-vaxxers is irrational, but that doesn't forego their fundamental rights, and people making this argument, oh, what about everybody else? Well, it's kind of a moot point. If 99% of people take a vaccine just through personal choice, then it doesn't really matter, does it? Right? Yeah. I don't like being told I have to do something. Like, for example, if I want to fly to Europe, it's perfectly fine if the Europeans themselves said, look, we don't want people who haven't been vaccinated coming to Europe, because it's their continent, their choice, right?
Yeah.
But for Qantas to say you can't fly with us unless you've had the vaccination is outrageous, right? And I would certainly get the vaccination anyway, because I want it for myself, and
it's your choice.
It's my choice, right? Yeah. But I don't think Qantas should be telling me to do it, right? And because everybody has a right over their own physical body, and whether or not to inject foreign substances into that body, okay? No one can force you to get a tattoo. No one can force you to get an amputation, and no one can force you to do any of these things. Why is it that with this one pandemic, it's now a critical factor? And the argument that is thrown up is that, well, you got to think about this is the argument the Queen put forward, right? The Queen Elizabeth. So, people should think about others who are, vulnerable, and you absolutely should think about others. Absolutely, you should, as a moral perspective, think about others. But to use that as a coercive excuse, right? To be able to okay, well, we're going to introduce all these mandates because you have to protect others. Well, actually, no, because all of those other people, as you said when you brought up the subject, are going to have the inoculation already. They're already going to be vaccinated. So who are these mythical grannies that we're all killing, right?
I'm just thinking who are these others, also young people who have been trapped in their homes for so long and affected education, are behind, have no job, no employment. There's lots of others They're also harmed too.
I'll bring up some statistics. I mean, keep talking. I'll bring up some statistics from the US. Here we go. I've already got it.
Oh, well, there you go.
Okay, so over the last year, among 13 to 18-year-olds in the United States, drug overdoses up 120%. Anxiety diagnoses up 94%. Depression diagnoses up 84%. Right, this is April 2020 versus April 2019. This is like, we've hit over a year of 2 weeks to flatten the curve, right? No one had predicted that we would still be facing restrictions after this period of time. And I really am left to wonder, what if we never had a vaccine? Okay, like, would we be in lockdown forever? It's just like, we're kind of, when all the politicians were making the gravest speeches, so locking everything down, totally radically changing our day-to-day life, they were saying things that like, oh, this has to last up to 6 months. This is like being very serious and being very cautious to think, look, this whole wave of infection, and they kind of, I think, just assumed it would be like a flu seasonal thing, like it would come through and then it would go away.
Yeah, well, we didn't know much about it. So.
No, but and so we accepted these costs, but now we're a year into it, and you're like, come on, like this is not. We've turned the total lockdown of our entire society into some kind of massive virtue signal, and we're ostracizing people who don't agree. We are playing down or ignoring totally the real life consequences and costs. Like I've just read out a few statistics there, but what's the consequences of 1 billion kids not having school for a year?
Yeah, and in developing countries as well,
absolutely,
where they don't have the resources to stay back an extra year, and they have to go work and feed their family. Like it's. And not everybody can work from home. Like, and if you're in the service industry or in farming, like you can't do that from a desk.
And that leads to another moral question with this vaccine, right? Because what people are saying is that the vaccine is necessary to end this trauma. Okay, but this trauma is self-inflicted. It's not the pandemic that's causing these lockdowns. It's people's choices. Now, these choices may be justified. Right, these choices may be justified by the enormous harm that this disease causes, and that the risk to older people, and the large numbers of people that have died already. Right.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a serious disease, but let's not kid ourselves. Like these are all policies that cause lockdowns. It's not that the disease shows up and says everyone get in your houses. It's people that do that, and so when we say that the vaccine is the panacea for that, the emancipation of humanity, well, it's not. The emancipation of humanity is people's policy choices. And when we see people say things like, oh, restrictions may last for years after the vaccine. Well, those decisions are made also by people. So let's not confuse ourselves about this. The vaccine is a moral good. You should take it. You should take it for the benefit of yourself and for others. But it's not something that should be coerced. We've got enough coercion going on already.
Yeah, that's true, definitely. And that argument that you pointed out in terms of the abortion argument with having the rights to your own body, because that's a very left belief too, is like being able to have abortion early on or whatever. Like it's but then but it's inconsistent with mandatory vaccinations. So yeah, I mean that stood out to me. Like once I heard that example, I was like, yeah, I understand now what the importance of having the rights to your own body and being able to make those decisions. I mean, thank goodness that children aren't really affected by COVID, because that would open up so many different things. But yeah.
Well, I mean, put it this way: if what happened to children, if it was reversed, if older people were fine because lifetime of exposure to various things, protected them, and it was children who were most vulnerable, then all of these restrictions would be entirely justified, right? And people would and coercion to get people to take vaccines and everything is justified because it's on behalf of people that don't have that autonomy, including over their own bodies, right? It's on behalf of people that don't have the age of consent, the age of being able to have emancipation from their parental decision making, right? And of course, it's the future of our society and culture, right? So people were lamenting that, and this is an interesting philosophical kind of discussion. The people were lamenting early on in the pandemic that people weren't caring enough about these older people. Like there was a view that, oh, if this was children, everyone would be freaking out. Yeah, that's true, but that's also fair, okay? And I think most older people themselves would acknowledge that. I don't know too many grandparents that wouldn't give their lives for their grandkids, right? So we have to ascribe a higher value to the future of humanity.
They're the ones giving, right? They're the ones going to drive the GDP eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. But and just like, and on every element, fairness, like, someone not having had much life versus someone who's lived a full and rich life. I mean, people were there was that one gentleman that at the age of 100, 101 passed away, that the captain, the British guy who managed to raise like 40 million pounds last year by walking around his front yard for the National Health Service, the British health system, to fight COVID. And he died of COVID just a few weeks ago. And he had a massive memorial service, and he was knighted before he passed away. There's a beautiful picture of him meeting the Queen at 100 years of age and them getting on really well. He was a great veteran of the Second World War, wonderful guy by every account. And people were lamenting the fact that he had passed away, right? But at the same time, it's something to celebrate, right? This is a guy who lived 100 years. He achieved more in the last year of his life than most of us will achieve ever. He was knighted before he passed away. Got to meet the Queen, a lifetime ambition, and lived a rich and successful life. Would he not have given up his life for any one of these children? Right? Like, of course he would. So it's perfectly natural for us to make these judgments. I mean, another great example of this is we can even make these sacrifices for objects. When the leader of, whose name I can't remember, but now he's got a huge wing of, I think, the British Museum named after him. He was the leader of antiquities in Palmyra. Palmyra being an ancient Roman city, famous for the Zenobian breakaway and all of this sort of stuff, massive rebellions. And ISIS blew up the temple there. ISIS also went around trying to destroy all the antiquities. And the leader of the antiquity, he smuggled out thousands and thousands of precious artifacts. And when he refused to tell them where they were, they executed him, right? So here's a man who decided that his life was not equal to preserving these things for humanity. And why did he make that calculation? Well, because these things are passed down through the ages and are there for the benefit of future generations, right? And he made that calculation for himself, and we can probably judge that a fair trade, right? Because they did that for the future. And if you do things for the kids, you're doing things for the future. And also, you saw this with the fire in Notre Dame. I think it would be perfectly reasonable to sacrifice oneself to save the treasures at Notre Dame, the crown of thorns and all of that, even if you weren't a religious believer, simply because it's a custodianship of all of humanity. We need to preserve these things. So, yeah, we do make calculations about the cost benefit of human life all the time. Okay. We don't talk about it much because it's like, it's perilous, right? There's a lot of moral hazards there. How many people in the nursing home is it worth to save, one child, right? Like it's not a calculation that humans think is palatable to make. Okay. Yeah. But
it's not trading cards. Oh my god.
yeah. It's not trading. It's a really great way to put it. It's not trading cards. Okay. But I think that the best benchmark to use is what would the older people themselves say, right? That we can say it was a fair trade in the case of these antiquities because the guy in charge of those antiquities made the sacrifice himself, right? The older people in all the nursing homes and things, I'm sure every one of them, their grandkids, their great grandkids, they would happily sacrifice themselves if that was a requirement. It's not a requirement, thankfully. We've got other options, but certainly, if the disease impacted young people, children, the way it impacts old people, if it was reversed, then there is no sacrifice that the society would make as a whole that we wouldn't think is justified, including forcing people to take vaccines.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah,
I like a personal level. I feel like all human life is valued, is valuable, and again, it's not trying to so I'm like, I wouldn't know how to answer that question, but yeah. But I do agree. Like, if I was 80 or 90, and I feel like, look, we need to lift these restrictions, but you might get COVID. But I'm like, you know what? I've lived a long life. Like, these kids deserve to live too. So
there's a famous clip of this British woman, 82 years old, who gets stopped in the street, and she's like, "I don't give a sod. Who's going to pay for all of this?" Like,
the young
people, exactly. You know the one I'm talking about, right? She's like, it's not me. I'm going to be dead. Like, no one.
Don't worry about me.
And she laid it out pretty clear. She's like, I haven't got that many years left of me. I don't want to burden everybody else. Now, I'm not saying that should be the rule, right? But it gives you a sense that some people have. Yeah. It's not just the young people that make sacrifices. Old people make sacrifices too.
Yeah, no, that was very funny video. But Precious, but I think the things are funny because you could sense there's something real in it. Like.
Yes, absolutely. That's why satire and comedy is essential.
Exactly.
They're the only people that can speak any truth around you.
Yeah. Right. Any final thoughts, Crispin? We went through your topics today.
Yes. So a lot of work is being done by Elon Musk and SpaceX and governments and so on Mars. And I am struggling to see the benefit of it versus the real life costs that we have here on Earth, right? So what Elon would say is that humanity on a long enough time scale on Earth, if we're stuck on one rock, is doomed, right? Because if you're in one house, eventually the house will burn down in a fire or get hit by a tsunami or an earthquake or something. And thus we need to have spread out throughout the universe in order to ensure that humanity will survive in perpetuity. And then we will and I think Elon probably, he hasn't said this publicly, but kind of imagines humanity as being the genesis of galaxy-wide intelligent life. Because once we've spread out to different planets, we will begin to evolve and adapt to those planets, right? We will naturally, through human evolution. And so we will evolve into different species over time and gradually spread throughout the galaxy. We might be the first intelligent life in the galaxy, but then perhaps eons from now, billions of years from now, there might be intelligent life everywhere, and they'll trace their history back to this weird little rock called Earth and these humans that decided to do this. This is probably what Elon and his eons of thinking, is thinking about. What I would say is that we're going to get there anyway. What I would suggest is to focus these billionaires' attention not on huge vanity projects like going to Mars, but solving the very serious problems that we have here on Earth. And in doing so, in improving the quality of life here on Earth, we will drive technological changes and innovation that will also help us explore the galaxy in the future. It's like a reason why they held off sending a probe. I can't remember all the details. Sending a probe into the outer solar system and beyond decades ago is because rocketry technologies were advancing so rapidly that what they would do is they might send a rocket off today, right? And then in 20 years' time, a rocket will be invented that's so much faster that it just overtakes it and keeps going, right? There's no point in doing that now. So what I would like to see is less egotistical vanity projects of these great minds, although you could do worse with that money for sure. but to really focus on the massive problems that have been happening across different classes and groups of society here on Earth as a result of the
what's
pandemic.
like one problem you would like to Elon or whatever billionaire to divert their intelligence and their money to?
Well, as I said in the video, this is just one of countless examples, but the fact that 60,000 people die each year of rabies, these are young people, right? And we have a vaccine to eliminate it. What the problem with the vaccine is that it requires like 3 or 4 doses, and it's quite expensive. Okay, what we've shown is we can produce 4 or 5 vaccines in a single year to eradicate a whole new disease, right? Using various types of vaccines to do that. There is absolutely no excuse for not being able to come up with a cheap, effective one-shot vaccine to get rid of rabies worldwide, right? The worst death that you can possibly imagine, right? If you don't ever look it up, it is absolutely monstrous what happens, right? And it's young people, it's people who are in poor areas. Half the people that die from rabies each year are from India, 30,000 a year. So it's something that Elon could deal with himself, right? Much more important, much more pressing than going to Mars. Okay. Having said that, I understand his vision. I can understand this eons year where humanity is suddenly the progenitor of countless intelligent life forms of different species throughout the galaxy. I think that's kind of a romantic thing. We could be that, but it's not the most important issue.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. Like, if there's a vaccine that already exists and they don't have enough funds and we can make it better, then yeah, totally agree. That's insane that it's still.
I'll make a video on it and talk about the problem of rabies and exactly how it all works.
I actually had to look back at my birth certificate and see like what vaccinations I've been given, and rabies was actually one of them. Like, the vaccination against rabies was one of them, and it was over a few years. So I think babies are still getting it now, like in Australia. I don't know, but
not many are actually. Not many are. So
okay.
You would have been a special case. It might have been like, whereabouts were you?
Well, I was born in Darwin. Everyone
that's why, because specifically Darwin. You could be exposed to some sort of tropical rabid animal, and therefore like bats, basically. So if you were born in Darwin or North Queensland, there are bats that have rabies. And bat bites are notoriously. I mean, I'll talk about this in the video. Bat bites are notoriously hard to detect. So you could be bitten and not know, and then therefore invariably die. So it would be it's amazing that you've got it, but it's a very expensive vaccine, very expensive.
Yeah, interesting. Huh. Oh, well, there you go. I've been inoculated. That makes me feel better.
yeah, much safer.
So my final thoughts is I watched Terminator on recommendation for Crispin.
The first one.
The first one. So we're gonna watch the second one soon. But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised. Like, it was quite good. In saying that, they talked about the future and like how things have changed, this whole dystopia, and it's only like 6 years from now in our timeline. But it was good. It was good. Really intense scenes. I didn't have my headphones on properly, so all I could hear was a really loud bass. And I was like, is this like an artistic choice where I didn't hear any talking? But no, it was good. And it was so obvious. It was so obvious that he was the father when he came back. But then I'm kind of intrigued what the second one is about. So like, does it address that timeline? Like, or was that just a plot hole?
Okay, so you're not supposed to think too hard about the time travel. That's one thing that
don't.
Where Terminator goes off the rails is when they try to explain that in later videos. It's a rabbit hole, right?
Right.
But the reason I got Charlene to watch the first one is because, of course, as everyone out there knows, it's all about Terminator 2. Terminator 2 is one of the greatest films ever, and so I got her to watch Terminator as background, right? It's not essential to watch it, but it kind of gives you the setting of what's happened, and but it's all prologue. Terminator 2, we'll let you know what her reaction is, because that's what we're getting her to watch.
Yeah. It's a good action movie. It still holds up. I mean, like, some of the scenes are a bit dated, but I mean, yeah, it was not too bad. Although it was, okay, one thing that gripped me about Terminator is the thing wouldn't die. And it kept jump scares and everything. I'm like, why is it dead yet? Like, how? It just doesn't give up. I mean that's human resilience for you, but
Mm.
I hope technology doesn't evolve so that it doesn't die. But yeah. Anyway, I think that's time for now, or all the time we've got today.
Mhm.
Any questions, any feedback, please leave them down below. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, like and subscribe. We're on our way to 1,000. That's our goal for mid-year. Well, yeah.
Yeah, please subscribe. We've got all the watch hours we could want. It's just a matter of the permanent residual viewers. So please, yes, subscribe.
Exactly. And Crispin does not want to make another Meghan Markle video to get us there. Maybe, don't know. We'll see.
We'll see.
All right, see you later.
See ya.